By now, we had a super deep dive into many amazing features about React components. And by the way, no worries if that is getting a lot to remember. You'll see a lot of that throughout this course, in the course projects, and in other modules. So this is really just there to get it out of the way, to introduce you to a concept. You'll see it applied then throughout this course, and therefore this will become clearer and clearer as we use the different things you learned about. We're not done yet though. In person component, we have that input where we can change the name of a person, right? Now, the approach or the way of changing this is absolutely fine here. However, if you want to get access to an HTML element like this input, but actually what I'm about to show you works with any HTML element, with any JSX element, I should say here, then you are not limited to setting up two-way binding, because that, of course, is nice for getting the value you entered. But let's say you want to focus that input. Let's say when we render all our persons here, the last person should automatically receive focus. Well, then this is kind of hard to do here, right? How do we focus this? In regular JavaScript, you could, of course, write something like in component.mount, so right after this rendered, let's say, you could use document query selector, select your input, and on that input, you could then call the focus method. Now, if we try that actually, and component.mount works here, of course, because it's a class-based component. If I try that, then I do indeed focus, but I focus the first one, simply because document query selector selects the first input it finds here. And additionally, this is not really that great because it doesn't refer to the input rendered by this component. Otherwise, it would render the last input because that was the last component rendered. So this code here actually executed the last time in that last person component. And it didn't focus the input of that person component, but still the first input it found on the entire page. Because document query selector is not something that is related to React, it is a general web or browser feature, a general DOM selector, and it always works on the entire DOM. It doesn't care whether we use React or not. And therefore, this is not the optimal way of selecting this. Sure, we could set up an ID here to select it by ID, but React actually has an easier way for us to select an element. A concept called refs, which stands for references. On any element, and that does really mean not just on inputs, but on any element, including your own components, you can add a special ref keyword. Now, ref, just like key, is a special property you can pass into any component. It is detected and understood by React. Now, ref can be used in a couple of different ways, and here's way number one, which is supported in older versions of React 2. You pass a function here, and this can be an anonymous arrow function, as I'm doing it here. And the argument you're getting is a reference to the element you place this on. So here we could name this input L, but you can name it whatever you want. In that function body, you then can use that. Therefore, here, of course, we could call focus actually, but that's not what I want to do here. Instead, let's say we want to use that in some other place of the application. And therefore, what you can also do is you can add a new property to your class. So not to your state, but really just to the class. By using this, then any name of your choice, like input element, but this can really be named whatever you want. And this holds the input L we're getting as an argument. So we're getting access to the input element here, and then we're storing this in a global property. So from that point on, we can use it anywhere in our application. And since component.mount executes after render, input element will have been set by then. So in here, we can call input element focus. Excuse me, this input element focus, of course, because input element is a property of this class. And therefore, this approach only works in class-based components, not in functional components. If we save that, it reloads, and if I toggle my persons, now the last person's input is selected, thanks to this reference. Now, this is one approach of using references, but as I mentioned, it's not the only one. Since React 16.3, we also have another way of setting up a reference. And that includes the constructor, or requires us to use the constructor. And in there, You can now set up your input element. So the same property I'm using down there, input element, by calling React create ref. So create ref is a method offered on the React object we're importing, and I'm storing it here in the input element. Now that means, of course, this is not necessarily my input. This is any reference object React gives me, whatever that is behind the scenes. You can now use this reference here, and therefore I'll name it input element ref to make it really clear that this is just a reference. You can now use this here instead of passing a function to ref. So this function approach is okay, and therefore I'll comment it out to keep it here. But you can now set ref equal to this input element ref. So to this property you're initializing here in the constructor. This holds access to this ref object React gives me, and then I'm assigning this to my ref property. And behind the scenes, React will make the connection, and input element ref will then actually allow me access to the element on which this ref assignment was placed. So now in component.did_mount, I can use this input element ref, so this ref property, and there I actually have a current property which you have to access first, and this gives you access to your current reference. So here I'll access current and then focus, because the current element stored in this reference here is this element here, so the input element, and that does have a focus method. So with that, we would almost be able to do that. Now one thing, if you add a constructor, you have to call super here. And of course, you should forward the props you're getting here to make sure everything works correctly. Always when you add a constructor, add super first. So now with that, we got everything set up, and now this app reloads. And you can see that still the last person is selected, thanks to our reference. So you can use either approach, either with React Create Ref, which is the more modern approach, or by using that function form down there to get direct access to the element. This is the older approach, and therefore it also works in older versions of React. And it's up to you to use which version you want, depending on which version the version of React you're using is allowing you to use.